too many children fall through the net. 10% of the population has dyslexia. 3% of the population has dyscalculia. 10% of the population has ADD. And as a secondary condition, those people would possibly have dysgraphia as well. So how do we ensure that children leave school having reached their maximum potential and receive the exam results that they truly deserve? Based on this, we could be failing almost a quarter of children by not teaching inclusive to their educational needs. To achieve this, we require a rethink. I propose a compulsory module for training teachers on dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and ADD. Such a module would cover the awareness of these specific conditions, but also how that individual takes on and retains information. There's no blanket approach for teaching these children. By the age of 4 to 5, children with learning difficulties realize that they are different. They either internalize this knowledge, become withdrawn, or in worst cases, become behavioral. The reason I feel so strongly about this is that I knew that I was different. At the age of 5, I knew that I couldn't remember my letter sounds the same as other children. I knew that my reading was slower. And back then, you would have to stand at the front of the class and you would have to talk out loud and read your books to your peers. This left me open for being teased on the playground for not being able to read. In secondary school, I remember my German class, and I remember learning in the entirety of secondary school 4 words in German, was ist das and nein, because the teacher would often say to me, what is that? She couldn't understand anything that I'd written, and she would often say no. I also remember my geography class, where I couldn't remember icons in the same way that I couldn't remember letter sounds. And so reading maps was very difficult. And my geography teacher used to speak to me. As the year went on, he would speak to me slower and louder because he thought I had a low IQ and I simply couldn't understand. And it was more about the way I was being taught and couldn't retain the information. I felt very sleepy in school. I often fought to stay awake, despite having a very good night's sleep. Needless to say, I slipped the net. I was failed along with thousands of other children. I left school at 15 and a half, having only achieved E's and F's in CSEs. That would be the equivalent of 2 levels below a GCSE in today's school. Luckily enough, I was lucky to gain employment, and I worked in a shoe shop. This is the first time I felt really inspired. My job was very functional, and for once, I was good at something, and I was very relieved to be away from my school days. At the age of 19, I was offered to join the management program, but I was very hesitant to do this, because up until now, I'd managed to cover up the fact that I could barely read, I couldn't spell, I couldn't do maths, and I couldn't write. But I was determined to move on and develop myself. So I joined night school. And this is the first time I'd heard words such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. And looking back, these teachers, I'd seen many people like me, many young adults going back to school, having slipped the net in school the first time. They were very familiar with my learning style and familiar with how I retained information. So I left night school with A's in English and maths. I went on to enjoy 16 years of a good career in business management until my first child was born, and then I changed careers to become a foster carer. And I fostered what was known as difficult to place teenagers. Teenagers who had had around 20 homes before coming into our home. They were either on their way to juvenile detention centres or coming from juvenile detention centres. One thing I realized about these children is that a lot of them had fallen through the net in school. Years passed, and I relocated to Dubai with my family. I was at a loss at this point of how to move forward with my career, and I eventually decided to work with children with autism spectrum disorder. I retrained as an applied behavioral analysis therapist, and I worked in that career for 11 years and worked my way up to a clinical supervisor. During that time, I worked in many schools across the UAE and Kuwait, and saw many children who were slipping through the net. Now, this is not a sob story. This is a success story for me. Today, I have a master's in ABA, I have a postgraduate diploma in inclusion, and I'm also an author. But it took longer than it should have taken, and it would have been amazing to finish my schooling at the age of 23 rather than 47. Now, this is not the case for a lot of people. A lot of children don't get the chance to go back to school. Today, 33 years after leaving school, I still see children slipping through the net because teachers are not trained in the signs and symptoms of these specific learning disabilities. We can see the impact of this outside of school. Prisons report that 30% of inmates have learning difficulties. This is 3.5 times more people in contact with the prison service than the population as a whole. This suggests what can happen, but it shouldn't come to this. The Skills Funding Agency says little thought is put into prison regime for special educational needs. These people in prison have trouble understanding and following routine. As a result, these prisoners are 3 times more likely to have been in segregation. So we as a community have a responsibility to children. So let's make a change to the way we train teachers. Let's ensure that no more children slip through the net. Thank you.